We hear the term AV over IP used a lot. It's a growing trend within the audio-visual industry. However, AV over IP is often confused with AV over IT, which essentially means a converged network. This course will walk you through the differences between these two very similar phrases before finally introducing you to the concept of IT over AV. Let's begin with AV over IP. This means that we're transporting audio and video, AV, using Internet Protocol, IP, and this uses a network switch. Internet Protocol is a layer 3 protocol, and a typical IP address looks like this. And when we transport AV, we use a process called multicasting, and this gives each audio and video stream its own IP address, and they look like this. Check out the multicasting course here on Academy to learn more about how this works. AV over IP exists in many forms already, but that doesn't automatically mean that these AV over IP solutions can just be sent over any IT data network. Remember, data networks are primarily designed for data transport, not AV transport. So just dumping our AV solutions onto an existing data network is not a great approach. We'll come back to this. AV over IT is the ability to transmit audio and video signals over an IT network designed for data. This concept only works for very highly compressed AV such as H.264 or HEVC. And it's these codecs that bring you YouTube or Netflix to your mobile phone. Because this data is so highly compressed, it makes its bandwidth requirement very low. And IT people love that because it doesn't interfere too much with their data bandwidth. It's high latency data, and that's easy to route over an existing IT network. This is the only exception though, because the reality is that most other AV will kill your IT network. MJPEG codecs can consume over 900 megabits per second, and that spells the end for any 1 gig data network. AV over IP does not mean that you can simply put AV on an existing IT network, because it will probably kill it. When IT networks are designed, they're usually oversubscribed. This means that the peak amount of data which might be used will exceed the bandwidth available on the network, often by up to 20 times, and this is called a blocking network. Let's look at an example. A 1 gig Ethernet switch with 48 ports can support a full 1 gig of bandwidth, incoming and outgoing, on all 48 ports simultaneously. The total bandwidth capacity of that switch is 48 times 1 gigabit times 2 in and out. That's 96 gigabits, and the switch is said to be non-blocking. However, it is common to connect this to another switch just using 4 1 gigabit links, and this creates an 8 gigabit bottleneck between the switches, giving an oversubscription ratio of 12 to 1. If we tried to send all of the possible data the first switch could support, we would lose almost 90% of that data inside the bottleneck. When an AV network is designed, the peak bandwidth requirements must always be sustained, because video always consumes high bandwidth whenever it's in use, unlike an IT network where traffic is very bursty infrequently using high bandwidth. If the video is 500 megabits per second, for example, then 500 megabits per second will be constantly consumed. And this means that the architecture has to be non-blocking, giving all the AV networks a 1-to-1 subscription ratio. Let's look at this a different way. IT over AV means the ability to transmit IT data over an AV network. It achieves the same result of having the convergence between the two systems, but by designing an AV network first, and then placing the IT requirement on top of it, the AV bandwidth is guaranteed. Whatever is left can be used for IT, and this is true convergence. AV won't run out of bandwidth, and nor will IT. Let's look at an example where the 10 gig switch is put in place for the AV network. Whether it's for a 1 gig AV or a 10 gig AV, you still need to use a 10 gig switch. So in this case, you can see we have a 10 gig AV port which gives you all the dedicated AV. But within that, you also have a 1 gig data port which guarantees that you have full 1 gig support. IT over AV means that the data is now riding over the AV network as opposed to the other way around. If it was just AV on an IP network, then this would be a standalone replacement for a matrix switch. If it was AV over an IT network, then the IT network would need to make provision for the AV to ride over it, and as we've already established, this would probably kill the network. Networks designed for traditional IT don't handle AV very well, but networks designed for AV don't have much trouble at all handling a little bit of extra IT traffic. IT over AV is the only way to allow a 1 gig IT network to work perfectly with any AV transport, whether it's a 10 gig SDVoE AV application, a 900 megabits per second MJPEG application, or even a 50 megabits per second H.264 application. IT over AV is true convergence because it eliminates any redundancy which happens with multiple networks in place, and the cost is reduced because, well, there's only one network instead of two.